I would like to thank the organizers for this excellent conference. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this intellectual adventure. So the topic of my talk is concerned with human free will in a world described by science. Western civilization has been dominated for over 300 years by science. Whoever speaks about free will in this context today is confronted with a paradox. On the one hand, we experience ourselves as having free will, of being able, at least on some occasions, to decide for ourselves which course of action to take. On the other hand, the scientific vision of humans sees them as determined by a set of scientifically describable factors. Concepts such as freedom of action, moral responsibility, and openness to transcendence do not seem to find a home in such a view. Biochemical or genetic, neural, hormonal causality seem to be sufficient to explain the functioning of the body, and neuroscience increasingly reveals the physiological bodily basis of cognitive faculties, which are formerly held to be the prerogative of the soul. Psychology and sociology bring out unconscious factors which guide our choices. Therefore, our awareness of being humans and not just animals or worse, machines, seems to be a collective illusion, which, although useful and perhaps even necessary, remains unfounded in reality. So I want to address this felt tension in the present talk. And I will proceed in three steps. In fact, first I examine a common strategy to overcome this paradox and will find it wanting. I then argue that we need a radical break with reductionism in order to accommodate both science and human freedom together. And finally, I want to show that creation offers a framework which is both coherent and successful in allowing human liberty to find its place in a world described by science. So first, freedom in a naturalistic world. In a naturalistic world, there is no place for human freedom. If all that there is captured by science, there cannot be any freedom, at least not of the robust kind which really makes a difference to actions. A naturalistic world, by definition, is exhaustively described by natural science. It knows only of natural causes and has no place for agent causation, which is governed by reason and free choice. It makes no difference here if the fundamental scientific description is of a deterministic or indeterministic nature, because chance happenings do not amount to freely chosen action. What we mean by being free is not only that precedent natural causes do not totally determine our behavior, but that we can decide for ourselves the cause of action, that we own it in a substantial way. Indeterminism is not enough, to quote Popper. The fact that there is no scientific explanation of free action is particularly clear for rational action. Physics, chemistry, biology use methodologies that are unable to capture this aspect of human behavior. The natural sciences do not even have adequate concepts for it. The argument has been run many times, from the time of Plato through Descartes to contemporary philosophers as Karl Popper and Thomas Nagel. C.S. Lewis has given it its canonical contemporary form, showing that reason cannot be reduced to physiological reason. Okay. Here is the quote from Lewis. Physical events must be linked to one another not as grounds and consequence, but as causes and effects. A relation so irrelevant to the logical linkage that it is just as perfectly illustrated by the sequence of a maniac's thoughts as by the sequence of a rational man's. A very influential answer to the paradox of human freedom in a world described by science has been provided by the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. He tried to solve the problem by including human freedom in the realm of noumena, things as they are in themselves, das Ding an sich, beyond or behind the phenomena, things as we experience them. Scientific knowledge is only possible of the phenomena. Human beings, qua free and rational agents, are not accessible to scientific description. Therefore, we cannot know, but only believe that we are free. Nevertheless, this is not an optional belief. We would renounce our dignity as moral subjects if we gave up this belief. When we act according to the moral obligation under which we are placed, we are free from scientific determination. In this way, and now I quote Kant, the contradiction disappears. The unconditioned does not lie in things as we know them or as they are given to us, but in things as they are in themselves, beyond the range of our cognition. Kant's answer to the question of how we can reconcile the natural scientific description of humans with their freedom is a special case of what Stephen Jay Gould would later call NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. The conception that science and religion concern domains that are totally distinct from each other. Such a view has the obvious advantage of ensuring that no scientific progress whatsoever can threaten human freedom. But it comes at a high price. It isolates our experience of being free from all that can be scientifically examined. In particular, such fragmented views cannot address the important question of the interactions between freedom on the one hand and scientific determinations on the other. Not only must NOMA-like approaches treat as illusionary our experience that the will can have scientifically describable consequences. I decide of my own free will to raise my arm, and I manage to do so. NOMA-kind accounts also cannot account for the fact that we experience our freedom as non-absolute, shaped by many physiological, environmental, social influences. In fact, our actions are on a continuum between completely involuntary, unconscious actions, like breathing, and deeply considered choices that engage our whole person. Recent advances in neurosciences have shed ever more light on this fact, but it is not a new discovery. Already Blaise Pascal knew it when he contemplated the power which flies have over human thought. He wrote, "The mind of the sovereign judge of the world is not so independent that it is not liable to be disturbed by the first din about it. Do not wonder if at present it does not reason well. A fly is buzzing in its ears." I hope there are no flies in this room right now. But such a continuum which involves at varying degrees scientifically describable factors and our freedom as morally responsible agents cannot be understood in a model that has isolated human free acts from science, as does the Kantian distinction between phenomena and noumena, or more generally, any NOMA-like approach. To arrive at a truly satisfactory solution, we must take Kant's criticism of scientism, which he attacked under the names of materialism and atheism, a step further. Certainly, his epistemology constitutes a real progress compared to naive scientism, which claims that nothing significant exists apart from what is accessible to the scientific method. However, the idol of scientism is not really dethroned by Kant or other types of NOMA. Indeed, they continue to consider that science offers a complete description of the domain in which it applies. Moreover, this domain is generally considered to be identical with what we can know. In particular, it is claimed that we cannot have any experience of something which goes beyond the scientific domain. They also typically postulate the causal closure of nature. A more radical recognition of the limited, fragmentary nature of any scientific description is necessary if we want to finally overcome the antinomy. The contribution of science, or rather these sciences, to our knowledge of humans is recognized, but it is recognized as partial. Each particular science adopts a specific point of view, a specific method, which is adapted to certain questions and leaves others aside. As in a spatial projection, it captures a certain dimension, but does not provide a complete description of reality. Even taken together, the natural sciences do not exhaustively describe reality or our experience of it. Other than scientific aspects of human experience, including the foundational experience of being able to make choices, must be taken into account if we want to obtain a complete picture of what there is and how we experience it. Such a perspective has the advantage, compared to NOMA, of offering a multidimensional but integrated image of reality, which makes room for human freedom, without treating it as an alien element, opposed to what is scientifically describable. It is true that the natural sciences cannot grasp this freedom any more than the personal dignity of humanity or our openness to transcendence. Nevertheless, such a multidimensional perspective does not relegate the moral and spiritual agency of humans to a mysterious domain of the noumena, as the Kantian solution did. Insofar as the scientific description is incomplete, we can recognize physiological causalities and at the same time consider that human beings act sometimes freely. There is no need to erect watertight partitions between the scientific realm and the realm of human agency, if only we recognize the partial nature of any scientific description of the world and of humans in it. The perspectives just outlined bear some similarities to the conception which the philosopher Steven Horst has developed under the name of cognitive pluralism. It is cognitive in the sense that it takes into account the constructive role of the mind in model building. Our models in science or elsewhere are idealized representations of particular features of the world. It is pluralist in the sense that it is inclined to take the plurality of existing models in the current sciences not as a transitory feature, but as a consequence of facts about how the mind models the world. Believing otherwise would come down to the rationalist assumption, I quote Horst, so the rationalist assumption that everything about the world must be intelligible to us in the form of a single theoretical framework. Not only does this assumption seem quite hubristic, but also our best available scientific theories do not support it. General relativity and quantum mechanics are inconsistent with each other. When it comes to scientific laws, Horst rejects the common empiricist account that considers laws to be at least universally valid statements that quantify over real cases, such as, for example, all swans are white. This kind of understanding is blatantly inadequate in the face of the most elementary scientific laws, such as Newton's first law: a particle initially at rest or in uniform rectilinear motion continues in that state unless compelled by forces to change it. In fact, in Newtonian mechanics, no body exists that is not subjected to any force, the force of gravity being universal. According to the empiricist conception of laws, Newton's first law would then be an empty statement, trivially true, because no body has ever found itself in the condition that the law states. But that's not the reason why physicists put it in the first place in any treatment of classical mechanics. But yeah, many philosophers of science seem not to be aware of that. Instead, cognitive pluralism takes scientific laws to be idealized descriptions of the real world that highlight the dynamic principles that underlie real-world kinematics. This conception is both realistic, laws are invariants in the real world, and cognitivist, laws are part of our representations of the world. The second trait is the basis for there being multiple sets of laws or theories because they are part of different representations, depending on the invariance studied in a given context. Unless the rationalist assumption is true, our mind necessarily understands the world in a fragmentary way, so that the plurality of scientific models is irreducible. Therefore, we should not expect any one particular science, or even the sciences as a whole, to provide an exhaustive description of reality. On the contrary, dynamic laws, I quote Horst, dynamic laws express potential partial causal contributors to real-world kinematics. Such a pluralist view of scientific laws has immediate implications for reductionism. However successful a certain scientific model is in a certain domain, it does not preclude the possibility that there are other causal factors at work. Take as an example the law of gravitation. It does not say anything at all about the question of whether, in addition to gravitational forces, other causal factors are present, which can be described by other laws, for example, electromagnetic forces. It does not even exclude the existence of extra-causal factors, which cannot be described by scientific laws, as would be the case for agent causation. Thus, it is simply wrong to assume that a scientific description of the world necessarily leads to reductionism or excludes free will. Horst's characterization of scientific laws has the great advantage of being close to actual scientific practice. If one accepts his account, the antinomy between scientific description and human freedom disappears. One only needs to accept the fragmentary nature of any scientific statement. In particular, the causal closure of the physical world is not a scientific result. It can only be established in a circular way. In order to see that the causal closure of the natural world is not a result of science, let us consider one common deduction which concludes from the principle of conservation of energy to causal closure. But the thermodynamic considerations that establish conservation of energy typically ignore situations in which a miracle occurs, or more worldly, in which a human interferes with measuring devices. Thus, the principle of conservation of energy only excludes any external intervention if one takes the idealization inherent in any model as limits to what can happen in the real world. The conditions stipulated in the model do not specify what can or cannot occur, but only under what conditions the model is a good model of reality. Therefore, the scientific image of humanity is unmasked for what it is, not a result of the sciences, but a result of scientism that has absolutized science. As if science could or should provide an exhaustive description of the world and of humans who live in it. Let us halt for a moment and contemplate what we have achieved up to now. A certain reading of scientific results leads to consider human action as determined by material factors that do not make room for human freedom and responsibility. Although this conception is based on scientific discoveries, it is not a result of science, but stems from the absolutization of science. It is thus scientist rather than scientific. Kant, and after him any NOMA-kind account, seek to save the dignity of man as a moral and spiritual agent by placing these aspects of human nature in a sphere inaccessible to scientific research. However, there is no need for such a dualistic approach as soon as we realize the fundamentally partial nature of any scientific description. Thus, our scientific knowledge about humans does not exclude that there are, at the same time, endowed with freedom, reason, and an openness to transcendence. So the spiritual and scientific visions of humanity are compatible with each other. But precisely what we have established so far is nothing more than compatibility. Acknowledging the fragmentary nature of scientific descriptions does not ipso facto prove that humanity is endowed with freedom of thought, action, and love. The fact that scientific knowledge is compatible with such freedom does not prove that it really exists. One has first to arrive at the conclusion that humans are free by another road, in order to ensure that the space left by the partial nature of science welcomes human freedom. But how exactly can we know that humans are free? So the first answer that comes to mind is undoubtedly the intuitive experience we have of freedom. Doesn't each of us experience the freedom of making significant choices? Could any argument that seeks to prove the contrary ever be stronger than the intimate experience of being free? The strength of this subjective evidence should not be underestimated. It finds further support by the cognitive suicide which anyone commits who uses scientific knowledge as an argument against human liberty. Scientific knowledge presupposes the proper functioning of human reason, which in turn presupposes freedom of thought. Nonetheless, some have tried to deny the evident. Reductionist accounts of human nature, which sees it as totally conditioned by material causalities, are eloquent proof of the possibility to deny human freedom. There are still advocates for the metaphor of man and machine, the title of the polemical book of Lamétrie. Thus, it is not without interest to look for some foundation for human freedom which goes beyond our immediate experience of being free. Finding a metaphysical framework that integrates both scientific practice and human freedom will allow us to tighten our understanding of the place of human liberty in a world described by science, beyond the subjective experience of freedom. And this is what I now want to do. In fact, I want to show that creation exactly provides such a framework. As is well known, creation provides a framework which is conducive to the scientific endeavor, as several of the fundamental presuppositions of modern scientific method flow from biblical theism. As the Creator is a God of wisdom and order, his creation exhibits order. As he is also all-powerful, the natural order he establishes is universal. Human beings, created in the image of God, are both able to and called to understand the created order. Even more specifically, the experimental approach is suitable for a freely created world. For we cannot claim to discover by creation, by reflection alone, what form God has chosen to give to the world. Moreover, the active approach adopted in experimentation is only appropriate in the face of a world that is not divine. Animism or pantheism, for example, are more inclined to contemplate reality than to manipulate it through experience. In addition, divine transcendence guards against scientism, the illusion that science can explain everything. God being transcendent, he is beyond scientific exploration. And the world being his handiwork also partakes of his incomprehensibility. This theme occurs frequently in Old Testament texts dealing with nature. It does not foster global scepticism, as humanity is created in God's image and therefore shares his privilege of knowledge. But it highlights the fact that human knowledge is always that of creatures, thus limited in scope. Historically, the conviction of nature's incomprehensibility underpinned Newton's empiricism. Humans cannot hope to attain an exhaustive rational knowledge and therefore need to perform experiments in order to see how God created the world. The legitimacy and even necessity of multiple forms of inquiry comes as a consequence of divine transcendence, combined with the creation of humanity in the image of God. Human beings are the image of God, not God themselves. Humanity reflects something of the transcendence of the God whose image they bear. They are part of the created world, but at the same time they transcend the material world. Therefore, any methodology developed to describe non-human entities cannot provide a complete picture of human beings. In particular, the notion of personhood extends beyond the scope of the natural sciences objectifying method, so that even biology is inadequate for describing humanity. Thus, divine transcendence, reflected in humans as the image of God, prescribes scientific reductionism. Non-reductionism has lately become fashionable in philosophy of mind, but also more generally in philosophy of science. Reductionist models have patently failed to make good on their grandiose promises to offer reductionist explanations for such basic aspects of our experience, such as consciousness, intentionality of thought, and rationality. Different emergentist accounts have been proposed, among which non-reductive physicalism features prominently. But note that God's transcendence, as reflected in his human image, encourages a more radical departure from reductionism than standard emergentist models, in which higher levels supervene upon a typically physical base level. Methods of inquiry developed to describe the inanimate world do not enjoy any privileges over more personally involved interactions with reality. Why try to deduce the latter from the former? Instead, creation as the handiwork of the transcendent God leads to a clear acknowledgement of multiple dimensions. Thereby, the contribution to our knowledge of each particular science is valued, but any absolutization of a particular science or of sciences taken together is rejected. Creation differs from other worldviews in that it places the origin of the world in the free act of the transcendent God. Creation does not stem from the nature of God, but from his will. The distinction between divine will and divine nature expresses the personal character of the biblical God. Only a personal God can will something into being that is different from his nature. Human action thus finds its natural place in a world born of divine freedom. As the image of God, humanity participates in the power to act of the Creator and therefore in his freedom. Otherwise, they could not stand as a covenantal partner before God, nor fulfill their role as co-workers in the earthly creation. In the ancient Near East, the idea that a human being is the image of a god is common for kings and sometimes priests. But in the Genesis account, the privilege of being an image of God is not reserved to certain men, kings or priests, but characterizes all human beings, all men and all women, without distinction. This, and I quote Richard Middleton, this constitutes a genuine democratization of ancient Near Eastern royal ideology. Such a democratization of the privilege to be God's image implies that ordinary humans, and not just kings or priests, are allowed to be significant participants in the historical process. Human dignity culminates in the notion of covenant, which God concludes with humans. This notion is so central to the biblical view of the divine-human relationship that we have come to refer to the two parts of the Bible by its Latin form, testamentum, Old and New Testament. The predominant role of covenant is an original feature of the biblical religion. Some rare texts from the ancient Near East speak of a covenant between a deity and a king. Gods are also invoked as witnesses for covenants between human persons or groups. But with one possible exception, there is no known example of a covenant that a divinity made with a human group, tribe, or nation. The faithful relationship to which God commits himself in dealing with humans over time is a distinctive feature of the Bible. Even Sunni Islam, while taking some of its roots in biblical revelation, does not know of any covenant that God would make with a person or a group of persons. In fact, the idea is hardly suited to the Islamic conception of divine freedom, which is so absolute that Allah does not even bind himself by his own word. This original trait of the biblical understanding of humanity's place in the world implies an exalted status for us. Certainly, we are not little gods. Biblical monotheism places humans unambiguously on the side of creatures, entirely dependent on God. But we are called to live coram Deum, before God and in relationship with him. In order to be God's covenant partners, we are endowed with substantial freedom. Otherwise, no significant relationship built on knowledge, trust, and love would be possible. The exalted understanding of human freedom which we find in the Bible manifests itself also in the role which humans are called to play in history. According to the first creation narrative, human history unfolds during the seventh day, the Sabbath. God's sabbatical rest underlines the great responsibility entrusted to humanity. Certainly, God does never cease to act, but he has delegated post-creational rule of the earth to humanity. This post-creational rule was already anticipated during the 6 days of creation. While the Genesis account shows God himself naming the different spaces set up during the first 3 days, he does not do so as much for the beings which inhabit these spaces and which are formed during the rest of the week, as if to leave room for human ordering activity, which the second creation account mentions with regard to naming animals. It is noteworthy that the biblical proto-history attributes cultural achievements to humans instead of treating them as divine gifts. The construction of a town, the invention of musical instruments, the casting of bronze and iron, viticulture, and power, and it seems even worship, are attributed to human activity by the Genesis text. All this highlights the human capacity to act and to shape their environment. At the same time, the Genesis texts underline the ambiguity of cultural prowess by placing a significant number of these exploits among Cain's posterity. Human scientific action in history is affirmed in the biblical history for better and for worse. Genesis 3 vividly reveals the importance of human choices. Humanity is not the victim of tragic conditions that would make evil inevitable. Ancient Near Eastern myths typically explain our experience of evil by making it part of the make-up of the world in general and of humans in specific. This is the case when Mesopotamian myths depict humanity created in part from the remains of a killed deity. Instead of being an indication of a high, semi-divine conception of humanity, those myths serve to explain the evil present in human nature. Not only humanity is the result of a strife between the gods, but it is generally created from minor, rebellious, even demonic deities. Not so in the biblical account. Here, evil enters the world by the rebellion of free creatures, who were originally created entirely good. The first humans had been placed before the choice between obeying the command of the Creator and rebellion. They should have resisted the tempter's voice. That human existence is marked by suffering, oppression, and death goes back to the fateful choice made by the first humans. But even after sin came into the world and with it its share of ills, humans are not abandoned to a fate over which they would have no control. Salvation opens a future that everyone is called upon to grasp, but which can also be refused. At the end of our journey, we have seen that creation offers the 3 ingredients necessary for human liberty in a world described by science. First, science is affirmed as a legitimate and efficient instrument in order to enhance our understanding of the natural order. Second, The multidimensionality of reality is recognized, so that the sciences only offer partial descriptions of the world. And third, humans are endowed with significant freedom, so that they are able to act and to make choices. This perspective has the advantage of offering a multidimensional but integrated view of humankind, providing space for our freedom without treating it as a foreign element or even opposed to the scientific description. The integrated view provided by creation makes it possible to address the important question of the interactions between freedom on the one hand and scientific determinations on the other. Obviously, this does not save us the painstaking work of elaborating multidimensional models in order to understand selected aspects of human behavior and their interactions. Creation provides a productive theological starting point. It is not meant to be the end point in our exploration of the world. Rather, it sets a framework which opens up promising avenues for research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I have to admit that it's, like so often, sort of a little bit an artificial situation, because I would fairly agree and can fairly support the views Lydia presented, but still I've got two little comments I'd like to make and to contribute, which go in quite different, you may say even opposite directions. The first one I'm more comfortable with than the second, because the first is mainly just proposing to make the argument against a reductionistic and deterministic scientism, which you, as I think, described quite well, even a little stronger, maybe. The second one is more sort of an open question I have, and I would like to arise, and it has some connection to, for example, the Luther case we mentioned yesterday, also involving the question of, well, being as a creature of a creator bound to this creator, and on the other side being responsible and acting and exercising choices. And it might be supposed as a kind of an Augustinian argument, if you want. I try to illustrate my remarks, like you can see on just a few, just 4 little slides I prepared. And I'm now the first comment. I fully agree with the point that you made that each scientific discipline just investigate specific aspects of in always too complex reality to comprehend. And by that, there could never be one perspective or all perspectives taken together that rule out free actions in another aspect of the reality, which by none of these perspectives, nor of a viewing together the perspectives, ever can be comprehended, understood comprehensively. But I would state that the situation of a deterministic scientism is even worse than that it always has to admit that there is some place in this total picture of several attempts to understand reality where freedom can't be ruled out by their perspective. But I would say that it's a sort of a self-misunderstanding of their own project of scientific understanding of the world. The multidisciplinary endeavor of science itself is an intentional action of trying to understand. And not just that, but it's also aimed to make intentional actions because of the better understanding of reality possible and more meaningful. For example, the neurosciences we talk about, the neuroscientist wants to find out and to understand causalities in the brain, not just for nothing, but in order to make intentionally acting on that possible. So it's always embedded, all these scientific endeavors are embedded in a kind of action and with the purpose of a broader project of intentional actions, and in that sense using this understandings or these models of understanding I won on this way to make out of that a deterministic scientific worldview is sort of a self-misunderstanding. The second remark, as I said, is maybe could be seen as an illustration of the Luther and Worms case we mentioned yesterday, if you remember. This famous saying of Luther, "Here I stand, I can't do no other." And the question is that an act of freedom, or is that, as Richard Swinburne proposed, maybe questionable as a morally positive act of freedom? And you could try to see that illustrated by that. If a person makes a decision in a certain situation, at a certain point of time, there is a situation which has its effects on the decision the subject makes, and there is some information about the situation which comes to the person and which the person takes in account for his decision. And the person has its inclinations, and it has reasons, and it has a certain character, certain shape of his virtues and convictions, and so to say an ordo amoris, which is found in the person at the moment of decision. And this character, let's call it ordo amoris in this situation, is not created by the person in that moment freely or chosen freely, but in the moment given where it takes its decisions, it's already there. And well, in another sense, it might well, as we also mentioned several times, be, wrong direction, be be created by the person itself because of other decisions it has taken before. But again, in this other decision it had taken before in another situation and with other informations and the character given then, also then the character which led to this decision was already given at that moment. And if now you combine this with the idea of creation and that we are created in the image of a free acting God, you have some initial point where the initial sort of character and ordo amoris must be traced back to this act of creation in a way. So my proposal to handle with that would be maybe freedom. It could be helpful to understand freedom more as a revelation of one's character through an action, which we experience as an act of choice. And if we do that, of course, a situation like the one you mentioned with Luther and Worms, his "I can't do no other," expresses that given his character, given his conscience like he has, and his values and his convictions like he has at the moment, he, as the one he is in this moment, couldn't do other, which is exactly expressing by something we notice as a choice, expressing the character he has at that moment. So having a character and revealing this character is sort of the other side of what occurs to us as making a choice. So that would be two proposals I would like to do.
Yeah, thank you for these comments. I certainly agree basically with both of them. So the first one, certainly there's more to be said than what I've said about or against reductionism. The only thing perhaps what I would really want to stick to is that science is worth pursuing independently of any practical aim. So science is also, and I would claim fundamentally, the pursuit of knowledge. And then that knowledge can be used for action. And yeah, on the second, certainly, for the what does freedom mean? Yeah, when I think about Luther, I must say, yeah, I would think that when he says, "I can do no other," I would really say this is kind of supreme expression of it. It's a supreme form of free act. And in fact, when we ask for, or whenever we use counterfactuals which includes modal claims, it gets very tricky. And you always have to make sure what kind of modality you speak about. And so it can be both true and false to say that Luther could do otherwise in that situation. In a certain sense, yes, it would have even been easier to do otherwise, but he couldn't do otherwise, giving perhaps his experience in prayer even during the night. We don't know what happened during the night. He asked for reflection, giving his convictions, his character. But in another sense, he could have done otherwise. Easily, in fact, he could have done otherwise. So whenever we use modal counterfactuals, we have to be very cautious. What are the presuppositions which we keep fixed? So yes, for me, Luther's act there is a supreme case of a free act. And in fact, I'm kind of worried about equating freedom naively with the possibility to do otherwise. At least my very limited understanding of the situation of the condition of the saved in the final state is that, yeah, we won't be able to sin. So in a certain sense, we won't be able to do otherwise than to do good. I'd hope that this will be our situation. And I think the Christian tradition has always held to this. But it doesn't mean that we won't be free. In fact, it will be the most supreme form of freedom there.
So thank you very much for this inspiring overview. My question addresses the extent to which human agents can shape the world in this Christian biblical framework. Just assuming now that a mind-involving interpretation of quantum mechanics would be true, along the lines of von Neumann and Stapp, perhaps. Just assuming that this would be true, what do you think? Would God have good reasons to create such a world in which human minds can influence the physical world in that way, or perhaps even in a stronger way?
I get always very nervous when people think they know what would be good reasons for God to do this or otherwise. I have no clue on this apart from revelation. And I've never thought about it, that I wouldn't see anything in the biblical revelation telling me either that a quantum mechanical world, according to Norman's interpretation, would be a good world for God to create or not to create. So it's a kind of question I prefer to be agnostic about. And historically, this is linked to the empirical method of science. It's very interesting in the history of science. The very idea of incomprehensibility of God and therefore of incomprehensibility of creation was an incentive for Newton and the empiricists to ask for an empirical approach in science. So, and therefore, we should decide, say, on these kind of questions from empirical sciences, and not from reflection. Obviously, when I say that that biblical theism leads to some of the key presuppositions of the scientific method, this is not meant to be a proof of biblical theism. And then if you want to turn it into proof, I'm not sure that it can turn it into proof, but if you want to turn it into proof, you would need to show that biblical theism is the only explanation or, say, metaphysical worldview which can support science. I think you can show this. It's always tricky if you want to do it, but at least what we can say that important competitors don't allow you for empirical science. So it's a claim that Joseph Needham, for example, has made for China. He used it as an historical explanation for the fact that the Chinese civilization was far more advanced than the Western civilization, but didn't bring about modern science. And in his opinion, the lack of the concept of creator God was an important obstacle to develop modern science. I think you can claim it for pantheism, because in pantheism you get the unity, that's fine, but you don't get the distinction, which you also need in order to do science. And then, I would say you have biblical monotheism, you have pantheism, you have so Unitarian monotheism. I don't think that Unitarian monotheism gives you science, because you once again you don't get they're difficult even to come up with the appropriate notion of creation, because once again you have only the unity and not the diversity, which gives you Trinitarian theism. And the other main competitor would be atheism, and there I go with Alvin Plantinga's argument, for example, that you can't, that atheism is inconsistent.
At one point in your talk, you said that choosing, and it seems to me that the answer is not quite complete or satisfactory, because nature is older than the human species. And even before the human species appeared, nature wasn't good. There were catastrophes, there were killers, really bad killers. There was suffering, bloodshed. Whole species disappeared several times. Even almost all life on Earth disappeared. So what do you say about that? Doesn't it suggest that the structure of nature, the structure of the natural order, favors evil?
In my opinion, this is, I would say, a major tension between the scientific worldview and the biblical worldview. I think a more difficult tension than the tension I addressed. I think that the tension felt between the scientific worldview and human freedom is just scientism. So it's not really between science and human freedom, but between scientism and human freedom. So you raised another question, which I didn't talk about, or I just touched on it, and I think it's a serious problem. I don't think that it's unsolvable, but even without offering any solution, or even without discussing the several solutions which are out there, I think there is good reason to stick with the theological truth, even if you're faced with difficult scientific evidence. And there is good theological reason to stick to the traditional picture that evil is the consequence of free action, of created free actions. There are not only human beings, there's also angels, and so this may be some explanation or a possible explanation for the difficulty you raise. But what are the alternatives? So if I accept evil as part of nature, that means as part of creation, that would mean that God created an evil world, and therefore I think he can't be good. And so it's the end of ethical monotheism, and I'm not prepared to go down this road.
Thank you. I guess a comment and question on reductionism and reduction. So I'm just wondering, because I think sometimes when we critique reductionism, it can kind of fall into also implicitly critiquing reduction as a scientific project. So I'm wondering, does a critique of reductionism require changing the nature of scientific explanation? And can we still say positive things about reduction within the framework that you,
Yeah, I think I go with Popper on this, who says that reduction is a great scientific project. Whenever it goes through, we learn a lot from it. So we should certainly aim for it, but we should resist the overall drive towards reductionism. What I was told by some scientists, but this is just anecdotal evidence, so it's perhaps not worthwhile pondering. But still, so he told me that he was doing an experiment, some kind of experiment, trying to show, I think, the reduction of chemistry to physics. So it was kind of chemical reaction. He wanted to reduce it to physics, and it didn't work out. And then he said, we just didn't publish the results. So obviously, if the reduction had been proven, then he would have published the paper. But the failure of this project didn't get published, obviously. So, and I think this is part of the reason that so especially from the outside, we get the impression, reduction is a great project, always works, and because the failures will just be ignored.
I would like to make just a little historical comment, which doesn't contribute a lot to the matter. A colleague of me, a church historian, always emphasizes that the protocols of Worms and so on, that there is no evidence that Luther has ever said, I stand here and can do no other. But this is just a little comment. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You see, you can go to Worms and you can stand on the place where Luther has stood. But yeah, there's a plate in the ground. But yeah, you're right. In fact, we have, I think, but you know more about this than I do. We have reliable evidence about this, the general discourse he gave, but the last words, which are the most famous, are not well attested in the sources. Yeah.
I'm very much in sympathy with your claim that acting in character, and especially acting in a virtuous character, is not only not incompatible with free action, but might be a supreme example of what it means to be free. Such a claim leads to a famous conundrum that has been widely discussed in the 13th and 14th century. How then it is possible to lose virtue once you have achieved it? Because if you happen to have a virtuous character, you will end up in loser situations all the time. You will never feel you will never even be tempted to do something incompatible with virtue. You just won't feel the pull. So it's always, ich stehe hier und kann nicht anders. I have no alternative to do the virtuous thing, and then there's no way of being corrupted. There's no way of becoming vicious. And that was a consequence most ancient thinkers were happy to accept, but the church authorities in the high and late Middle Ages felt very uncomfortable indeed with it. So what would be your stance towards that problem?
I don't think there's a problem. I hope to be in this state one day, by God's grace. But But I don't, yeah, would the problem then that you don't have an explanation for Adam's sin? Is that the problem, or what kind of problem would this situation rise?
No, so your answer would be virtue is just unachievable in this life.
Yes, yeah. These once again, these questions of modalities, we won't achieve it in this life, yeah. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I have two questions / points. So you referred to Joseph Needham, which and his research on Chinese civilization, which is now dated. But like recent research shows that it was basically the retranslation of Timaeus of Plato, which does have a monotheistic conception of creator as well. But it wasn't like, strictly speaking, biblical theism, which brought about the seeds of modern science. But it does stand on your point about monotheism anyway. So this is one point. So given that it's a historical fact that you're referring to, the naturalist can say, well, yes, of course, this was a false belief. It had some sort of utility to it, but now the days are gone. This is one thing. And the second question that I have is that the naturalist can say, look, in the before the 19th century, nobody thought of biology intruding all these questions. We just thought that it's Newtonian physics and that's all. Or Kant thought that cosmology cannot be a science, but now we have a sort of a reintroducing cosmology as a science. So how can we be so certain that science in the future, with the new branches that it might have and the new resources that it might gain, it won't be able to respond to the questions? You're definitely right. Right now, it doesn't have the resources to answer all the questions. But how can we be certain that science would not achieve that status? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So on the first point about the origin of science, obviously any monocausal explanation would be wrong. And so I'm not claiming that biblical theism explains the origin of science as the only factor in it. And because otherwise you would have the problem, why biblical theism didn't give rise to science earlier. Yeah? When you read so what we would call the first scientists or the fathers of modern science, the biblical worldview certainly plays a role. And a stronger role probably than, say, any Greek texts. Therefore, I think there is a point to be made that it's really the biblical worldview and not just the influence of coming back of Greek philosophy there. And even, yeah, some of the first, say, Kepler or Galileo would argue against Aristotelianism, for example. So it's certainly more than just Greek philosophy. But once again, it's not a monocausal explanation. I'm not aware of this thesis, but there may be some truth to it. About the possibility that in the future we'll find a science which will explain everything and how we can be certain not to find it. In a certain sense, we can't be certain. We can't be certain about the future. But we have to act, to think, to act, and to make our choices in our current situation and given our current knowledge. And therefore, I don't see why I should accept this hypothesis of a perfected science answering all questions in the future and then base my choices on this today. In particular, because I think there are good reasons to think that we will never find this kind of science. It's just a misunderstanding of what science is and what science can achieve. For example, science doesn't offer anything in principle, any metaphysical answer. Science is about the metaphysical origin of things. It always works from a given framework. You always have to start from something which exists and from a certain legal order or nomological order. So I don't see what kind of science could ever explain this. I also think that human knowledge in itself is limited, and we are part of the world we want to understand. I'm also, I must say, very convinced by the kind of argument Lewis offers, and others before him, that reasons can't be deduced to natural causes, so there are clearly limits, principal limits to science.
Another word about Luther, or rather what Luther, it would be of interest to us if what he meant was, I can do no other, given the whole state of the world as it is a second before I was acting, and therefore all the forces acting upon me, because in that situation there are no alternatives for him that he can choose. And he doesn't have a certain sort of goodness. Now, we can call it moral goodness or whatever, but a certain sort of goodness, the goodness that someone has in fighting against temptation and doing the right thing despite all the forces. He doesn't have that. But he has a very different sort of goodness, the goodness of acting perfectly in the light of reason in difficult circumstances. Okay, but there are incompatible good states, and that is only one of many of them in the world. You could have this good state or that good state, but you can't have both at the same time. There are equally good vocations for humans, but they can't pursue both of them at the same time, etc., 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 of which there are innumerable instances. And among the choices open to God are to create a world in which there's quite a bit of evil and quite a bit of temptation, and we fight against it, or alternatively, a world in which we're all saints to start with, and there are no temptations. They seem to me equally good worlds, but God has to choose between them. It seems to me that the best world will be one in which we have choices to start with of forming our character, but can form our character in such a way that subsequently we cannot do evil in that sense. You rightly said that in the world to come, you would like to think that we had freedom. I would think we have enormous freedom, but not to choose between good and evil. There are many sorts of freedom other than that. If those were the only sorts of freedom, God would have no freedom at all, because he can do no evil, but he has enormous freedom because there are an enormous number of possible good alternatives.
I'm tempted to say yes and no. Yes, I agree with most of what you said. I am just nervous. I'm not convinced that, say, of the idea, which perhaps, yeah, this is not what you said, but say what other people may say in similar contexts, is that the choice between good and evil adds to freedom. So if you go back to the paradise, you would find people saying Adam couldn't have been free, or it added to his freedom that there was the possibility to sin. And there I resist, because I think it gives a kind of explanation to sin or to evil, which takes away from its evil character. And there is a difference, I think a qualitative difference between doing good and choosing to do good and choosing to do evil. So choosing God is an expression of your freedom. Choosing to do evil is an abuse of your freedom and leads into slavery. And therefore the two situations are not symmetrical. And I'm quite, even on a phenomenological level, I'm quite intrigued by the difference between the guidance of the Holy Spirit and dynamic possession. So you could say in both cases, this is an action of a supernatural agent on a human being, but it feels and it looks very differently, and you can't, the being guided by the Holy Spirit in fact restores or brings you freedom to full expression, whereas say dynamic possession really takes away your freedom, or take addiction, etc. So there is a difference, a qualitative difference between doing good and doing evil, and freedom is linked basically to doing good, not to the choice between good and evil.